Becky here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. Well, I'm going to be making yet another batch of vinegar today and thought, it's been a couple of years since I did a how to make vinegar video, and so it's time to do another one because I try to, with each new video I do like this, I try to be a little bit more thorough because I get tons of questions on this. So what you're going to need is whatever product you want to use to base your vinegar off of. It can be anything that is edible. It can be grains, it can be a vegetable, it can be fruit, that's most commonly used, and it can be herbs. I tend to use a lot of scraps. So apple scraps, when I'm getting the apples in and I'm putting a bunch up as apple pie filling or making applesauce, and I don't really want all the peels and cores in there, then I'm going to save those and make vinegar out of them. In this case, today I'm actually making a citrus peel. These are mandarins and juniper from our front yard vinegar. And this would be something that it would be good for anything, but based on the flavor is going to depend on how you want to use it. This would be something that would make an excellent cleaning vinegar because of the products I'm using in there. Now, if you want some more information on the many ways to use vinegar, I just did a new video on that as well that I'll be linking to in the description box down below so you can learn all about the ways that you can use all the different types of vinegar. And then back here, just to show you real quickly, I've got a dried herb vinegar that I'm making as a hair wash. I have just a plain citrus peel vinegar, and this is one that is all done. This is apple vinegar made from scraps from our own apples. And I just strained this one out. So the other thing you're gonna need, I do recommend using a half-gallon jar, but if you're new to this and you're just wanting to sample it, maybe try going with a smaller jar. So just keep in mind, with the measurements I'm gonna use in this, if you're using a quart jar that's half the size of a half-gallon, then you will half the amount. If you're using an even smaller jar, like a pint jar, just to do a little bit, you're going to use a quarter of the amount of sugar that I'm going to be using. And also, honey, raw honey in particular, is an excellent one to use. The reason I go with organic cane sugar instead is I can get it for less than what I pay for honey. However, if you're making the vinegar for more medicinal uses, I do highly recommend using raw honey to make the vinegar because you're going to get the medicinal benefits of the raw honey in your vinegar. Now, if you're concerned about the sugars in the vinegar because you're diabetic, you're keto, whatever it is, understand that sugar is needed to create vinegar. However, the end process has no sugar left in it. There should be no sugar left if it fully ferments. But it's the sugar that first gets converted into alcohol in the first 2 weeks, and that's the bubbling stage. And then after it's done bubbling, 2 more weeks is needed for it to convert the alcohols in there into acetic acid, and that's where you get your vinegar. Now, the time frames are going to be estimates. There are a lot of variables that can come into place that can maybe shorten the time, like maybe you're doing this in the summer and it's a lot warmer in your home, and that can speed up the process, or if it's in the winter and it's a lot colder, it can make it take as long as 6 weeks. Also, the amount of sugar you use will determine the length of time, but it will also change the overall outcome of the vinegar. Too little sugar will give you a weak vinegar, but more sugar might give you a stronger vinegar, but it's going to take longer. Now, those sugar amounts are going to be variable depending on what you're using. Because of the things I'm making my vinegar out of today are low to no sugar items, they have no natural sugars in them, then I'm going to be increasing the amount of sugar I use. So in this case, you're going to use a minimum of a half cup sugar up to 3/4 cups of sugar to whatever that is. So if you're making floral vinegars, mint vinegars, oregano and garlic vinegar, which is a good one for both your chickens and for making salad dressings out of, then that's the amount you're going to want to use. And the amount is the same if you choose to use honey instead, the same amount. Now, when I make the apple vinegar and I'm using really sweet apples in there, then I'm only going to use maybe 1/4 to 1/3 cup of sugar in that. And I just estimate the amount based on how sweet the items are going in. When I'm using apple scraps, so this one here was actually made with chunked up apples. So I was using the whole apple. But if I'm using apple scraps, I'll use a little more than 1/4 cup just to make sure there's plenty of sugar in there, because there's not going to be as much sugar in the peels and in the cores as when I'm using whole apples. So these are things you just kind of want to weigh out. It doesn't have to be an exact amount, but there is a certain amount that's got to be at least a minimum and a maximum. Let's say you're using straight apple juice. It didn't have any sugar added to it, but it's a very sweet juice. Then adding too much sugar, like say you put a half cup or more into that, it can actually prevent it from fermenting at all. It might still ferment and you might end up with a really strong vinegar, but it may not ferment at all, especially if you're adding a whole cup of sugar to something that's already got a lot of sugar in it. So when I go to make my vinegar, I just toss my ingredients in there and I kind of look at how much I'm putting. Now, if I'm using dried ingredients like I did here, I'm only going to fill the jar up just a little bit because the dried ingredients obviously take up a lot less space when they're dried than something that's not fully dried. And then I've got some fresh juniper. I just cut a bunch because I wasn't sure how much I was going to need. And so we'll just kind of pack my jar with some of that. I'm pretty sure I'm not putting all that in there, but because I got branches and everything in there, there's a lot of airspace in there. So it's okay if I put in even just a little bit more because it takes up so much room, a lot of airspace in there. So those are the different things you got to consider. And by the way, anything you use should be either fresh or dried, but not frozen. I'm not saying it can't work if it's frozen, but a lot of times if you're using frozen material and you're not adding anything fresh or dried to it that wasn't frozen, it may not turn to vinegar, or you may have very weak results. So I only use fresh or dried ingredients, but if I was to use frozen, you can do it. It's just you're going to have to take an extra step. That's going to be adding something like I did here with the orange peels, or even using some kind of starter like whey, or my own homemade fermentation starter, which that's another video I'll link to down below because I use that for a lot of things. I've never had to use it for vinegar, but if I was using frozen goods to make vinegar and didn't have anything fresh to add to it to help get it going, then I would add the fermentation starter. So because of my ingredients, I'm using at least a half cup. I think I'm going to put about closer to 3/4 of a cup. And I use my lid for measurement because I know my lid holds about a half cup of sugar. So again, organic cane sugar. You don't want to use white sugar that's made from genetically modified sugar beets. Cane sugar is going to be best, and organic especially. Now, I also do not recommend using coconut sugar or molasses because these are really high in minerals. They can really affect how well your vinegar or anything you're going to ferment with that. It's really going to have an effect on it. Back when I used to make water kefir, I was using coconut sugar for a while, but noticed that it was getting weaker over time. My kefir grains were not multiplying like they used to. And then I learned it was because of the minerals in the coconut sugar. So that's why a good organic cane sugar or honey is going to be your best option. And then once I got this in there, all I have to do is top it off with water. Now what I'm using is our own filtered rainwater because I know it's free of fluoride and chlorine and any other chemicals used in your city tap water. But if you don't have access to well water or rainwater or anything like that that is going to be free from those chemicals, you can at least dechlorinate your water. The chlorine is the one thing that's going to affect the ferment. The fluoride, though it's bad for you, is not going to affect how well your stuff ferments, but the chlorine can. So I do highly recommend if you have to rely on your tap water, your city tap water, and it is chlorinated, you can boil it for, I think, 10 minutes, and then you're going to want it to cool all the way down to room temperature. That's going to remove the chlorine and at least some of the chloramines that are also added to that. I'll just use this chopstick here because I use it for stirring that vinegar. You can stir this up, press things down. The sugar will dissolve, so I don't worry about that. It's got a whole month to do it, so it will dissolve, and I'm not too worried about it. And I am going to be stirring it daily, especially once it starts bubbling, daily for about 2 weeks. And what you want to do is you want to cover it with some kind of cloth, paper towel, or coffee filter, anything that's going to allow airflow. So the cloth needs to be a natural cotton cloth. It's okay if it's printed as long as it's cotton and it's breathable. So I made a bunch of these little jar covers because that makes it look nicer on my counter. I used to just use chunks of, cloth that I'd torn from my fabric scraps and then a rubber band. You can do that. But I really like this better because not only does it look nicer, it's already got the elastic in there, so I'm not having to fuss with a rubber band. And these are really fast and easy to whip up, like super easy. And so I'll link to the video I did on these. So I leave this on my counter for a whole month. Again, it's the first 2 weeks. It's doing all of that bubbling, all that activity. And because it can bubble over, this probably won't be as much of a problem because of the types of things that are in there. The juniper is actually going to hold the citrus peels down. But so with the citrus peels back here, this I just started. So it's just a couple of days ago and it's just now getting bubbly. It can take up to 3 or 4 days for it to get really active. And when it does, depending on what's in there, it can bubble over. This one back here is super bubbly. So you can see all this stuff is what's happening is the bubbles are pushing all of that material to the top. So the 2 reasons for stirring is that it's going to kind of stir things down and get them back down in there so they're not bubbling over. But it's also going to prevent mold from growing on whatever's floating above the liquid surface. Now, when I first started doing vinegars, I tried various ways of weighing down the whatever it was I was fermenting. It never fully worked. And it really kind of impedes the vinegar because you're cutting off the oxygen, the airflow, which is necessary. The oxygen exposure isn't as necessary in the first 2 weeks. Once the bubbling stops, so that's when you really need the oxygen exposure because it is the oxygen exposure that converts the alcohols into acetic acid. One of the most common mistakes people make is they confuse winemaking with vinegar making because wine, when you got the airlock on there and it's preventing oxygen exposure, you know that once the airlock bubbles stop going through the water in the airlock, once that stops, that means your wine is done. With vinegar, when you've got it like this and you don't see it bubbling anymore, then that means it still needs at least 2 more weeks. Some people mistakenly think it's done and they don't even taste it, or they wonder, or if they do taste it, they wonder why it's still sweet and tastes like alcohol instead of like vinegar. Well, it's because it's only halfway there. It still needs that last 2 weeks of oxygen exposure, which at that point, it's very unlikely you need to keep stirring it because usually, not always, the whatever you've got in there is going to stay below the liquid level. Now, some people at that point strain everything out, put it back in the jar, cover it, and then let it ferment for 2 more weeks. I don't do that. To me, it's just an extra step that's not necessary. I just leave it. I have it all ready to go. I don't have to add any more sugar to it. It's got the right amount of sugar in it right from the start. The only thing I have to do is for the first couple of weeks is stir it daily. It might not need it in the first 2 days, but once it starts bubbling, then you'll need to do that every day. Some days you may, if it's super, super active, you may have to do that a couple times a day. Now, some questions you'll get is, how do I know when it's done? When you know what vinegar is supposed to taste and smell like, you can usually tell it's at a pretty good acidity by just tasting and smelling it, and you'll know at that point. But if you really need to be particular about making sure you're at a 5% acidity because you're going to use it for pickling, then I highly recommend you get yourself some universal, it needs to say universal pH strips. They need to be the kind that go all the way down to 0. And you can use those. And this is one of the reasons I do new videos all the time, because something I didn't think of in my first videos where I showed this is when you go to test your vinegar, take only a tiny bit out. I use a shot glass for this if I feel like I really need to test it. So I can put the smallest amount in there. It just needs to be enough that you can dip that strip in there. You just dip it in there, swirl it around, then you pull it out and you compare it to the colors and look at the numbers. And what you're looking for a 5% acidity, you're looking for a 3.5 pH. So the numbers aren't the same because one is measuring the pH while the other one is measuring the acidity by percentage. So that's why the numbers are different. But again, 3.5 pH, 5% acidity. And then you're going to discard that because you don't know what kind of chemicals may be on that pH strip. And so You don't, when I first would try that, I'd just dip it into the vinegar. Well, you don't know what's getting into your vinegar, and I hadn't thought of that before. So it's better to just take a little bit out and test it that way. And that way you can be more assured whether or not you can use it for canning. Not all of your vinegars are going to be created equal. Some of them may have a low pH of 2.5 even, which would mean it's definitely going to be good for pickling. Others might have a pH of 4, which can still be a great vinegar to use for everything else. It just might not work well for cheese making or for pickling. So yeah, once it's done, you're just going to strain it, and then at that point you're going to want to store it in some kind of airtight container. It needs to be airtight, or what will happen is it'll keep going. And once it's to vinegar, then it's gonna basically reverse and clean up after itself and get rid of all the acetic acid in there. And then what you're going to end up with is just nasty water that will end up molding on top. If your vinegar gets mold on top after it's done, after you've strained it out and you've had it in storage, that means it's no longer vinegar. You didn't have a tight enough lid on it to prevent the oxygen from getting in. So in this case, like in jars like this, what I started doing is I get these ball lids that are supposed to be leak proof, but they're not entirely leak proof. But then I also add a silicone ring in there to ensure it's going to stay airtight. You can also use recycled pickle jars. They have a nice seal on them. Anything like that. I've done that before too. Or you can also use a good brand like this one here, the Bormioli. This is the one I recommend. It's an Italian made bottle, a swing top lid. This is definitely airtight. I bought these years ago initially for storing my homemade meads. And let me tell you, they work and they don't explode. If you get the cheap Chinese made ones, they can explode on you under pressure. So if you, let's say you bottled up your vinegar and it wasn't quite done and it's still a little bubbly, it can build up pressure in there. But if you're using it for kombucha, mead, and stuff that you want kind of bubbly, that's why I recommend this as well, is for those. So, and I will link to some of these down below. Again, jars like lids like this or anything that's got a good airtight lid. If you just use a regular plastic cap on top, it's not going to be tight enough to prevent the air from getting in and reversing your vinegar. And if you use metal lids, the canning lids, the vinegar can degrade those and cause them to rust. I learned that lesson too. And then keep in mind, you can see all kinds of various things growing on your vinegar, and a lot of it's totally safe and normal. And I do cover that in a separate video called What is Growing on My Vinegar, and I'll put that also in the description box down below. But one of the most common things you're going to see, you're not going to see this on all your vinegars. Like I won't see it on this one. I won't see it on this one or this one, or at least it's very unlikely. But on the apple vinegar, this can either form during the process of the brewing or after you've got it in storage. Any of your like pear, peach, and apple, those will all get a really nice SCOBY on them. And it's just this thick gelatinous mass. That is actually a good sign. There's nothing wrong with that. When I get those, I throw mine to my chicken. Some people use them and convert it into a kombucha mother. And it's basically the same thing. Typically for vinegar, you call it a mother. And for kombucha, it's a SCOBY, but they're the same thing. Basically, they might have slightly different blend of yeast and bacteria, but that's what they are, is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. They both are. They just have slight differences. And remember, you can make your vinegar out of anything. People ask me, can I make it out of this, that, and the other thing? Yes, 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 yes. As long as it's edible. Unless you're going to use it for cleaning, but even then I still say stick with edible things. Because if you're cleaning your kitchen surfaces and stuff, you're going to want it to be something that's totally safe and non-toxic. So I never make my vinegars out of anything that is not edible. So any kind of herb, vegetable, grain, fruit, these things can be used to make vinegar. So whatever you have on hand, I never pay for things to make my vinegar. It's usually something that comes out of my garden or peels that I might otherwise throw away, which by the way, I have a video I did a few years ago on the many uses of orange peels. So I only buy organic because I have many uses for tea and so much more, flavorings and things. So please, I'll link to that video down below as well, so you can go check that out and learn a little bit more about what you can do with your citrus peels. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, you found it helpful, and if you're new to vinegar making, I hope this gives you the boost you need to get started, because it is a super easy process. and you can get some really great results and never have to buy vinegar at the store again. And you'll know exactly what it's made out of. Oh, and don't forget to click on more or show more somewhere. Look down here somewhere below the screen. It will either be immediately below the screen or maybe down a little bit farther, but above the comment section. And that will open the description box to find all the links I'll be putting down below. And please share with us in comments, what is your favorite kind of vinegar to make if you're already into it? And how do you use it the most? All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.